you went to a speech this morning by Jim Prentice that was pretty interesting. Tell us about that.
So as a reporter covering the leadership race, I can tell you I think this speech set a new high watermark in terms of the level of rhetoric that we're hearing during the leadership race. So Prentice gets on stage and he basically is speaking to teachers who are angry after the labor unrest, to parents who are frustrated with the absence of schools in Alberta. And he basically says that the school shortage is, quote, nearing crisis proportions, that it's preposterous to expect post-secondary education institutions in Alberta to run without stable, predictable funding. And he promises, and this is perhaps, certainly, actually, I think the biggest promise we've seen so far in this election campaign, 50 new schools in addition to the 50 new schools that were already promised under former Premier Alison Redford, as well as the 70 renovations. So a big shout out to schools, to teachers, to unions, looking for some support from that sector.
Yeah, did he also... Your story, the first version of your story online said he also talked about the task force on teaching excellence that we had discussed in previous episodes of the podcast. This had to do with evaluating teachers and regulating the teaching profession. And what did he have to say about that?
Well, this is really, really fascinating too. So he, in the speech, reporters get an advance copy of the speech. And the speech that we wrote from for our first version of the story, he calls it the so-called Task Force for Teaching Excellence. And then he goes on to say that he has spoken with hundreds of parents in the past month and has, quote, yet to meet even one who is preoccupied with changing how teachers are evaluated or disciplined. Now, we all know that that was a huge controversy when that task force report came out. Teachers were so angry, and Prentice is clearly saying in this speech that he doesn't agree with some of the findings, though he goes on to say that some of them have merit. But clearly, once again, an attempt to reach out to all of those angry teachers to get their support in advance of the coming progressive conservative leadership.
What do you guys think about this strategy? I thought we weren't going to hear. I thought education would stay quiet because I thought the leadership candidates wouldn't want to get into that hornet's nest. But yet, here we go down the path.
I think it's an interesting speech. Yes, interesting in the sense that it's interesting because we've been expecting a lot of really dry rhetoric from these candidates. But also, I think what Prentice is doing is speaking a lot of common sense. People, they want the schools built, first of all. Can you do it? That's the question. They've been promising these schools and then realizing the money's not always there. And the P3s have been changed now because they can't build schools with P3. So the question is, can they build them? He's saying, I'm going to build them. I think he's talking to the teachers and the parents by saying, we're not going to do any major changes. So it's not some sort of dramatic or revolutionary speech. It's a speech that, in a sense, it could have been given by Redford 2 or 3 years ago, that chose not to. Like, she's been antagonizing teachers, antagonizing parents in many ways too. So I think that he's gone back to almost a middle of the road. This shows he's not just a right-wing conservative. He actually is showing, I think, some progressive elements here as well.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting little attack on Jeff Johnson too.
Oh,
let's notice that. I mean, Jeff Johnson took a lot of flack for this report and backing it up, and I think that Prentice obviously saw an opening here that this was not going over well with teachers who he would like to lure back, although I don't know if that's going to work yet. But Jeff Johnson was vulnerable on this one, certainly not just for breaking promises, but for raising issues that Prentice is right. We're not the top concern of parents who just want their schools built and their kids educated. So we see a little Tory infighting, which is like we hadn't seen yet in this campaign, surprisingly. And so it's maybe it's going to open things up a bit. And I have to say, I think it's the first time that Mr. Prentice has stepped out in a major way to be controversial.
Yeah, that is very true. And I'll say that in the scrum following the speech, that was just maybe an hour ago, Mr. Prentice was asked about Minister Johnson's future in the cabinet, and he was very politic about it, and just said, that Minister Johnson's done a great job, but he certainly did not guarantee that he would keep that position. So it was a very interesting speech on many fronts. Yeah, and certainly the first big step by Prentice onto the stage in terms of playing politics.
That's a really big infrastructure promise. Another 50 schools when, as you said, they're finding it. I don't know if it's that they can't find the construction companies to build. I think the P3s, they weren't getting the deals they wanted on them for sure. I really wonder if the ATA who became such a big part, or the teachers who became such a big part of that Redford coalition to push her into the leadership, will be enticed back by this speech. Well, the reaction in the audience, I'm just wondering, it was a crowd of people who had bought tickets, right? They were Prentice supporters, or people who at least had bought tickets to hear the speech?
That's right. It was an event of, there were roughly 800 people at the Edmonton Expo Center in Northeast Edmonton. It was one of those typical fundraiser events where, you know, a business would purchase a table and then it was filled with people that they knew. But we saw unions. There were unions there. There were engineering firms there, you know, the usual people who come to these kinds of events, law firms, that kind of thing.
What did they react? How did they react to the speech?
He got a partial standing ovation from the crowd at the end. They certainly reacted very strongly with applause to the segment on fiscal accountability. He sort of did his normal stump speech, in which he goes over his 5 platforms. They reacted very strongly to his pledge to be fiscally transparent and reformat the budget, and he got a lot of applause on the education front as well.
I think this will play very, very well in suburban Edmonton and Calgary, and probably other, you know, growing communities where even with the new schools, it hasn't been enough. So that's really interesting.
It might also.
Go ahead. No, you go.
I was just going to say quick. It might also answer Danielle Smith's release of earlier this week saying they'll build 100 schools. So Prentice has quite often been playing to the Wild Rose in this, with his thing on property rights, fiscal accountability, and the Wild Rose tried to get out in front of this education thing by promising 100 schools. I think that answers that one.
Yeah.